Greetings to you, and welcome to this special Acton Institute event. Today's event features a topic of great personal and geopolitical importance. Hong Kong is a vibrant and creative city which has long been characterized by its free, entrepreneurial, and open spirit. This spirit unleashed prosperity and peace for Hong Kongers and is embodied by its most prominent entrepreneur and newspaperman, Jimmy Lai. Yet those freedoms are being increasingly suppressed. Under the guise of the Beijing-imposed national security law, Jimmy was arrested by authorities and has been confined to prison for nearly 4 years. As his trial resumed last week, he took the stand in his own defense, speaking for the first time publicly about the charges against him. Today, we have a special panel to discuss Jimmy's situation and the situation in Hong Kong more broadly. Our panel is hosted by Acton co-founder and president emeritus, Father Robert Sirico, who is a personal friend of Jimmy's. Our distinguished panelists are also longtime personal friends and colleagues of Jimmy's and include Mark Simon, former Next Digital Director, Mary Kissel, Executive Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor at Stevens Incorporated, and William McGurn, Wall Street Journal columnist. We thank you for joining us for this special event and for your continued support of Jimmy's cause and prayers for his release.
Welcome from the headquarters of the Acton Institute here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to our international audience viewing this discussion. I'm really delighted to be joined by the other participants and want to begin and get into the discussion right away. So let's start with you, Mark. You have worked with Jimmy. You have intimate personal knowledge of undoubtedly many of the things that are being discussed in the trial. Give us an update on where that trial stands right now.
Well, Jimmy was already in jail for convictions for other incidences, public disorder, and a trumped-up fraud charge when he started this trial for national security back in late November of last year, 2023. The prosecution presented their case, then magically sometime around late June, they decided they needed to take a 6-month break. So Jimmy is just back on the stand for his defense. In other words, the prosecution they waited about 5.5 months, and then he is going now. And he started November 20th. Essentially what it is they're going point by point, refuting what the prosecution says. As for Jimmy's condition, he is 77. He's going to be 77 on December 8th. He has been in solitary confinement. For some reason, the government is trying to convince everybody that he has requested 4 years of solitary confinement. And so we are constantly worried about his health. The updates that come out of there, it's very difficult because my situation legally, it's impossible for the family to speak to me. I get everything secondhand, but you do get information. Jimmy's spirits are good, but we're worried about the body. He's had a few physical issues. He is diabetic. He had a tremendous rash problem over the summer. What's really concerning to us is Jimmy is going to have a really tough time in the next couple of years. Stanley Prison, which I've been to many times visiting people, is a pre-World War II prison. Jimmy is in probably one of the worst spots in the prison because they don't want anybody to see him. After the AP photos came out last year, they moved him to a more secluded place where he doesn't even see sunlight. So we're quite worried about him. But lately, in this last 20th, and I'll let other people comment on it, we're starting to see the Jimmy of old when he gets on that stand.
How is he responding to his mistreatment? I mean, on a personal level, if you have any insight into the psychology.
He's very clear. He was very clear. I had very regular communications with Jimmy until he was convicted because he was allowed to see people every day. So it was possible for him to write letters. It was possible for him to get things to me. He made it very clear to me. He said, Mark, I don't want to complain about the small stuff. And he doesn't complain. I mean, he doesn't want to be the one who's always grabbing the attention. He specifically asked me early on, he said, make sure everybody else is okay. And he tends to be that way. Jimmy was, we have to remember when we look back at him through the wonderful Acton Hong Konger, Jimmy was, came over in a small boat to China, slept on floors, probably not much softer than that prison cell. Jimmy was forged in fires that our grandfathers were forged in. In other words, he's a tough, tough guy. But also there's a large part of him with his faith and with his outlook. He doesn't like to complain. And also when he knows when he's complaining, in his mind, when he complains, he's actually giving them what they want. So you rarely get a complaint from Jimmy Lai, ever.
Mary, what's the current status in Hong Kong? I was there last January, almost a year now, and I attended one day of the trial. I have to say that the Hong Kong I visited then was very different than the Hong Kong that I'd visited for many years previously. I used to describe Hong Kong as New York's Chinatown on steroids, and now I describe it as New York's Chinatown on Valium. What do you know about what's going on in Hong Kong? What remains of freedom in Hong Kong and its independence?
So thank you for having me, Father. It's an honor to be here alongside these panelists. Just to give viewers some context, I lived in Hong Kong in the mid-2000s. I ran the Wall Street Journal op-ed pages, all the opinion on Asia Pacific from Hong Kong. So I saw the free Hong Kong. And then later, after I moved back to the United States, I served as the right hand to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And so I saw policymaking and played a big role in kind of changing the American people and the world's view of the nature of the regime in Beijing. And as part of that, we tried as best as we could to call attention to the incredible degradation of freedom in Hong Kong, which had actually started back in the mid-2000s when I had lived there. The regime in Beijing and its lackeys in the city were already starting to degrade freedoms, to manipulate elections, etc. So this had been going on for a long time, but it really, of course, accelerated after the pro-democracy protests, which Jimmy peacefully was a part of. And I had a real battle within the State Department to tell the truth to visitors and the world, really, about the state of freedom in Hong Kong. The department kept saying, well, these freedoms are eroding. And I'd say, well, what freedoms? You can't protest. There's no peace. There's no right of assembly or speech. The controls are enormous. And unfortunately, Father, I think there are two things to tell viewers about. The first is that there are no freedoms in Hong Kong. There's no rule of law. It is another mainland city run by a totalitarian, genocidal regime. And in many cases, the surveillance and the oppression in Hong Kong is greater than even other cities, because the regime is so paranoid about this freedom-loving people who enjoyed freedom for so many decades. And secondly, it's not safe to go to Hong Kong. Father, I'm surprised that you went. It's not safe for any American, Taiwanese, etc. The rule of law is very arbitrary. We know that there are Chinese Americans who have been detained, unable to leave. The United States government doesn't talk about it. And so, this fight that Jimmy has had has exposed what the designs are of the party, not just on its own people, what they consider their subjects in Hong Kong, Macau. They look to places like Taiwan and they're near abroad. But this is the vision that they have of Chinese dominance more broadly. It's no coincidence that the Chinese Communist Party talks about things like the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative. They have global ambitions. And I think one of the great sacrifices that Jimmy Lai has made has been to make very clear just how hollow the regime's promises are, just how brutal they are, just how much they disregard rules, how much they disdain treaties, and how this is a vision that we all need to take note of. And so I think, his struggle has been mighty. I know he misses his family. He relies on a deep faith, which I think is just a remarkable thing to witness. But Jimmy really is of global importance, not not just of import to the people of Hong Kong who have lost their freedoms, but because he serves as a warning, a weather vane of China's ambitions and its brutal vision for the future.
To what extent do you think the crackdown on Hong Kong generally and on Jimmy in particular is a reflection of Beijing's concern about Hong Kong itself and the freedom of expression in Hong Kong, or the possibility of that spirit leaking out into mainland China?
Well, the security forces within China are more numerous than the People's Liberation Army, which tells you that this is a top-down totalitarian regime. It relies on brutality for control. It is more concerned about its own people and afraid of its people than anything else. And so is it particular to Jimmy? Jimmy had a special import because Jimmy was entirely independent of the party. I recall when I lived in Hong Kong, it was notable that, Jimmy never really socialized with the other Hong Kong tycoons. He wasn't interested in making nice with Beijing. His family had been the subject and victims of the regimes back in the Cultural Revolution. So he knew what it was all about. When the party threatened to shut down his factories, he sold his business. He never returned. And he refused to play their game. And so that's very threatening to the party. But also, I think his deep faith is threatening to the party because, as you know, Marxist-Leninist regimes aren't God-fearing regimes. They don't believe in God. They view themselves as their ultimate authority. And when we were at the State Department, the secretary went to the Vatican several times to plead with Pope Francis to speak out on Jimmy's behalf and not to do deals with the communist regime. Unfortunately, we were rebuffed the second time we went. He even refused to see us. So, we need that moral authority of the church, really, to speak up on behalf of this very special, blessed man who is suffering on behalf of his people, but also on behalf of all of us who care about freedom and freedom-loving societies.
I want to come back in a moment to the question of the Vatican, and perhaps Bill, you'll have something to contribute on that. But Mary, what do you anticipate the change as a result of the elections in the United States might mean for this entire affair?
So there's a remarkable bipartisan consensus about the adversarial nature of the regime in Beijing. President Trump, to his great credit, woke up America and the world to its nature and started to take measures to contain and to punish Beijing for its actions. Remember that we were the administration that declared crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities in China. That has been a landmark finding that Secretary of State Pompeo made. Other nations have followed suit. We've seen legislation passed, bipartisan legislation, that has put a focus on those activities. We sanctioned high officials. We put travel sanctions in. There were a number of measures taken. We also reached out to allies. And this was a framework that was continued under the Biden presidency because it's bipartisan. So I would anticipate, particularly given the choices for Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, the latter of whom I know well, that these policies, this truth-telling, will continue. We have a very complex challenge here that isn't like the Soviet challenge. The CCP is, of course, deeply entwined in our economies and our international institutions. They've infiltrated us here at home to a degree that I don't think the public is entirely aware of.
Right.
So it is, again, just to go back to the subject today, Jimmy Lai is a key reason why the world is aware of this behavior, because his suffering has made it very clear about their intentions. There's no denying it. He's committed no crimes, and yet there he sits in Stanley Prison in solitary confinement. There's no denying that. There's no hiding that.
Right.
It's a travesty of justice, and he's a symbol for all people who care about freedom.
He's arguably, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is he's arguably the most famous dissident now in prison, certainly journalist. in prison, maybe even religious leader in prison in the world. And I note that there's been an acceleration of attention in the last month or two as the trial has continued. Now Jimmy testifying himself. Bill, you are, we've got to say you're the godfather because you are, even though you're Irish. You helped in Jimmy's spiritual journey. Give us a sense of the role that faith plays in his perseverance and the generosity of spirit that he's displayed.
Well, you know, it came up in court last week. He was asked about me and said I was a close friend and godfather. And a Chinese friend of both of ours, I won't name, said, you know, it sounds kind of funny to me. They make a big deal of this, but they might have more sinister readings into the word. And I'm thinking they should have been playing the theme song to Francis Ford Coppola's classic about the Corleone family.
Yes.
Jimmy has been a very spiritual guy. He converted to Catholicism in 1997, just about the time Hong Kong was handed back. And I confess at the time he converted so fast, I really wondered what he believed. You know, now today I'm kind of ashamed of those thoughts, because in prison he's really used it like he's in a monastery. He's reading all the time. As you know, he's drawing religious art. There's one of his pictures of Christ hanging in or on an altar in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York and one Catholic university. So he's really growing. He reads all this stuff. In fact, Cardinal Zen used to be his big visitor. He used to say it was such a pain going to see Jimmy these days because he always like had a question. He'd bring some question like, what does St. Athanasius mean when he said this? And he said he'd have to read up on his theology to talk to Jimmy.
Some little point from the Summa Theologica.
Right. He was reading that too. So
yes, I remember. Yeah.
He's really grown. In Witness, Whittaker Chambers said, communism gives man what he really needs, a reason to live and a reason to die. And the communist promise is false, but Jimmy's found the true promise, and it makes sense of his suffering. He's embraced it, and he's just, it's an incredible model. And I should say, he's embraced his faith. It's made him stronger in prison, but he wouldn't be able to do it without his wife, Teresa. She's a rock.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the difference between male and female strength really comes through to me. Teresa, of course, is very close friends with my wife. They say the rosary together over Zoom and so forth. And, you know, Jimmy's like male strength. They once had home invaders when I was living in Hong Kong, and they tried to take Teresa's wedding ring. And Jimmy fought them. He got conked over the head with a wrench, hurt, but they didn't get the ring. That's Jimmy. He'll fight to protect what he loves. Teresa is sort of the female side of the virtue. Her strength is endurance. She endures, and you can almost feel the strength flowing into Jimmy from her endurance and her resolution. So it's really something to behold. And look, the Hong Kong people know what's going on. This is a sham. They're presenting Jimmy as though he's some kind of Osama bin Laden. I mean, he's, as someone said, he's going to be 77. He was 73 when he was arrested. They put him in chains. You know, they have all this extra police and stuff, like he's going to bust out of prison like James Cagney or something. It's really silly.
That was remarkable. When I was in Hong Kong, everything was going fine until I was dropped off at the prison, and I noticed the number of guards that went down the street, and then there were stanchions with other auxiliary police with machine guns, and that was quite an intimidating thing to get in. And this was before the lines. Now there are long lines to get into the trial. You mentioned Cardinal Zen and his visits. Are those continuing?
I don't know how often he's allowed in. He's also very frail. I think he's
Yes.
92. But I will say this: on last Tuesday, 45 Democrats were giving stiff sentences for participating in an unauthorized primary. And who was there when they were getting sentenced? Cardinal Zen showed up. Same thing. Next day was the beginning of Jimmy's testimony. Who's in the courtroom sitting next to his wife, Teresa, when Jimmy comes in is Cardinal Zen. You know, at a time when so many people that ate at Jimmy's table and laugh with him and stuff now shun him, Cardinal Zen has just been an extraordinary pastor.
He was there the day that I went to the trial as well. And does Jimmy have access to the sacraments? Do you know?
Well, there's been a flap over communion. My understanding is that he doesn't, but there's some dispute. I mean, he's really kept isolated, you know, and that, you know, solitary is usually in most penal systems a penalty. You get into a fight and you're put in solitary for 2 weeks or something. It's usually a penalty. With Jimmy, it's been most of these 4 years, and solitary really does something to a man. It's hard to stay focused when you don't have that human contact. So there's been a lot of allegations about his treatment, and they've kind of pressured him to say, no, he's been treated fine. As Mark says, I don't think his nature is not to complain. He will bear it. Look, what he's always wanted to do is have his say, defend his actions. He was not anti-China. He was not anti-Hong Kong. He was pro-freedom and pro-Hong Kong. And the government pulled out all stops to pressure him to plead guilty and avoid what we have now, Jimmy speaking freely on the stand. One of Jimmy's friends, again, says it reminds him of an Apple Daily editorial meeting with Jimmy holding forth on different issues. He's really back to his old self. And that's very dangerous for the government because he's very popular and charismatic.
Mark, what's your sense of the response globally to groups like PEN and other government officials or political leaders? Am I correct in discerning there's a momentum that's building?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we used to talk a while ago, and you know, it was Mark Clifford who's written a very good book on Jimmy called The Troublemaker.
Just got my copy of it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I've read most of it. At one point in time, I think it was Bill who said it felt like at the very beginning, it felt like there were three of us, you know. And now it's grown and it's grown. And I think the real thing that attracts people to this is just the truth of Jimmy's situation. In other words, Jimmy basically saw the communists for what they are. He was defending a free society. Bill's 100% correct. Jimmy has never been anti-China. In fact, I consider Jimmy a patriotic Chinese. He has never, I was with Jimmy for 20 years. Now, if we were causing that much trouble up in China, as we're alleged to be, and wouldn't we have been in trouble before that for things in China? Now, we got in trouble for some stuff in Hong Kong now and then, but we never did stuff in China, and he never would get involved in things in China that would essentially overthrow the government. So people have become aware very clearly that essentially this is a government that's destroying someplace. I think it also helps quite a bit that a lot of people know Hong Kong, are very fond of Hong Kong, and they're seeing it going downhill. And then here's this man who's standing there. The world is starting to see who Jimmy Lai is. Sometimes when you say the most famous dissident in the world, most famous political prisoner, other people, you know, get worried, get upset about that, or they have other people. But I think it's the truth now. I think Jimmy is the most well-known. I go places now, and when I mention Jimmy's name, people know it. Early on, people did not know that. So I think the world is really starting to pay attention to this. I'd add one other thing too. I'm plugging two of Mark Clifford's books today. Mark wrote a very good book called Today, Hong Kong, Tomorrow, the World. And I think that's one of the things that's waking people up. The nature of this regime and the nature of what they undertake in Hong Kong is really what they're looking to do abroad. In other words, when we talk about words like transnational repression, where they're going after dissidents abroad, where they're in places like the Solomon Islands, when they're in the Philippines causing trouble, this is the same game plan as Hong Kong. In other words, this is what we need to expect from the CCP regime. I'll quote Bill, I hope he doesn't mind. As he always says, we have to remember Xi Jinping is a Leninist first. He's not it's Marxist-Leninist, but he's a Leninist. And he's pushing that political system ruthlessly all over the world. And I think what happened is people recognized that Jimmy was a guy who stood up and said, look, just leave us alone in Hong Kong. We're doing fine. And they couldn't take that. They couldn't even handle that.
I want to circle on back, perhaps to you, Bill, with regard to the Vatican's silence in the face of this. I mean, one of the saddest things that I think about when I think about this whole thing is this man converted to the Catholic Church, and everybody was very pleased, you know, with all of that. And now he's being, as it appears, abandoned by the leaders of the church. Not a word from either the Secretary of State or the Holy Father.
It's inexplicable and inexcusable to me. You know, that I think the practical reason is that they have this deal with Beijing, which has proved a disaster, right, and they can't raise anything like Jimmy Lai. Look, I think the new cardinal, I hate to say, very disappointed in him. I don't think he's reached out to Teresa Lai. I can understand someone saying, look, if I speak out and make a public case, it'll only hurt your husband. But I think in that case, what the church has an obligation to do is to say, but if you need me, you need to get a message, call, you know, Father Joe or Father Mike, give him a contact. And as far as I know, that hasn't been done. I could be wrong, but I don't see it. And it's very disappointing because of all the people abandoning Jimmy, to have your own church do it. I think, you know, millions of Chinese Christians feel the same way. It's just inexplicable. And Cardinal Zen, that's why his witness and his faith for these people, he's just there when they need him. They know he's on their side. It's been so extraordinary. You know, you were talking before, Jimmy appeals to four kind of baskets of people. One are really free market people. You know, I first bonded with Jimmy over shared interests in F.A. Hayek, you know, right, the Austrian economist. And a lot of the free market types really embrace him. So like your Acton Institute. Right. The second are pro-democracy people. Jimmy believes in self-determination, and he's been pushing democracy for a long time. So those people support him. The third are people who believe in press freedom because he had a press and he used it, kept it going to report on the government. And they took his paper away from him. I mean, literally seized it without a court order. The final basket are his fellow Christians. Now, some people, like all of us on this podcast here, we are in all the baskets, right? But some people only have one or two. I can't tell you how many people come up to me at random at an event or something and say, just want to let you know, my wife and I are praying for Jimmy Lai every night. It's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. There's historical precedent. Mary, you may be familiar with the Vatican's diplomatic posture under the Cold War with the what was it, Cardinal Casaroli, and how they tried to negotiate the church freedom in Eastern Europe. Do you see any parallels here? I mean, it seems obvious to me, but you might have some insights.
Well, I mean, the great hope was that Pope Francis would emulate the late Pope John Paul II and speak truth to
Remind
power.
us of what you mean by that.
Well, Pope John Paul II, of course, made common cause with solidarity in Poland behind the Iron Curtain. He was a beacon and of freedom and freedom of spirit. He was someone who, alongside Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, through their clarity of thought and action, helped bring down the Iron Curtain. And the hope, of course, was that Pope Francis, particularly at the beginning of his papacy, when he, presented himself as a humble servant of God, who washed the feet of others, who had, grown up in a very oppressive, under a very oppressive regime himself, would understand this and serve as a similar beacon. And unfortunately, we've seen just the opposite. We've seen him travel to communist Cuba and shun the ladies in white. As my fellow panelists have just indicated, we saw him clinch a deal with the communist regime in Beijing to share the consecration of bishops with them, which is, of course, entirely against church teaching. There should be no authority higher than God. And he's placed the communist officials in between the church and God by allowing them this kind of authority. It was a step that, of course, Pope Benedict before him refused to do. And we've seen him get embroiled in political matters and really align himself with anti-freedom forces. And it is, as Bill said, completely inexplicable. And we went to the Vatican to plead, not just with the Pope, but with Cardinal Parolin and others who have been involved in this deal in Beijing. And we were on the first visit very politely received into the private quarters of the Vatican, and we had an audience with Pope Francis, and he listened, and then did nothing. And we went back to try again. We had another meeting scheduled with him, and the night before he canceled it. So that tells you, I think, that there is an awareness within the Vatican. There's a certain shame of the Pope's behavior. I think he intuitively knows that it's wrong. Otherwise, he'd be speaking out publicly in favor of his actions. He'd be defending what he does, but he doesn't do that. And so I think it is a disappointment to Catholics around the world, or those of Christian belief, or really anyone who believes in morality and what's just and right. Because this trial is a sham. Jimmy is a believer. He's been true to the church. And I think it is one of the greatest stains on the Catholic faith, the behavior of, unfortunately, this pontiff and those around him.
Yeah. Mark, you're a businessman. I mean, you were the executive director, basically, of the whole business side of Jimmy's life. How do you see the connection between personal freedom and economic freedom? Well, I know this is a question Jimmy would love.
Well, it's all tied in. Look, Jimmy believed in what I would call the basket of freedoms. In other words, when your back is up against the wall, which Jimmy's back, his back, he's basically been fighting with the Hong Kong with oppressive forces for most of his entire life. And so you're always looking for allies. And we used to call it the basket of freedoms. In other words, if they take away religious freedom, that means they'll also take away the basket of economic freedom. They'll take away the basket of free press. So the tie-ins are incredible. The other thing, too, is it's unique to Hong Kong. What we have to remember about Hong Kong is Hong Kong was not a place where basically there was like an oil field like Saudi Arabia or something like that. Hong Kong was all about the ability to come to an open market, a free market, a place where the government was not picking winners, and you, based on your own ability, could succeed. And that means personal freedoms. If you didn't have personal freedoms in Hong Kong that the Brits granted us, yes, we did not have a full democracy, but we had every other aspect of personal freedoms in the territory for many, many years until I'd say really 2019. Yeah. And once you destroy that personal freedom, that ability to make personal choices in all areas, in all creative things, once you destroy that, which they have done, things start going downhill. And so essentially what you're seeing now in Hong Kong is you can almost see it in the rental rates. In the high-end places where the expats live, those rates are dropping. Why? Because those people are leaving. In other areas where you're seeing, like where the mainlanders would come down from what you'd see a more repressive regime in their mind, those rates are going up. But it's not an equal trade for the government. If you don't have personal freedoms, if you don't have personal choice, you're not going to have business choice. You're not going to have economic choices.
Well, Hong Kong, I think maybe it'd be helpful for people who haven't been to Hong Kong to understand the size of Hong Kong and then compare that to its previous economic might.
Mary and Bill can go at that one all day. I'm sure.
Well, I mean, it's a city of 7 million people who produced really unparalleled economic opportunity and upward mobility simply because of those freedoms, right? The small government, the low flat tax, the connectivity to the rest of the world. I mean, it really was the jewel of China. And the irony, of course, is that this tyrannical regime could have used Hong Kong as a model to lift up, the entire mainland, more than 1 billion people, and of course has chosen the opposite. One thing I'll say, Father, I talk to investors, CEOs, boards across the United States and in Europe, and I think because of Jimmy, in some major part, they now understand that they have to get out. And so some investors can get out right away. They can just sell their holdings. Other, companies have, started to decouple by moving their operations to places like Vietnam or closer to us here in the United States, to Mexico. And, I think the public only hears about the Fortune 100 companies like, Apple and Tesla that are stuck in there. But that's not the majority of companies in China. There are thousands and thousands of others, and they get the joke, and they're leaving. And they're leaving Hong Kong as well. And you also saw that most notably, and Bill, maybe you can speak to this as well, with the media companies in Hong Kong who realized the danger in stationing people there. And they left, moving operations to Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea. It is simply not a safe place to be anymore. And the tragedy is that Hong Kong could have been the model for real prosperity,
Right.
not just for the Chinese people, but for the world. I mean, the United States could take a lesson from the flat tax in Hong Kong. And unfortunately, it's proved just the opposite.
Yeah. Bill, why don't you address yourself to that question of the media, both in terms of companies leaving Hong Kong, but also more generally worldwide? What has been the reaction to their colleague being arrested for essentially speaking his mind on his editorial pages?
Well, internationally, a lot of groups have raised this case. I was just at Mark and I were just at a Committee to Protect Journalists dinner the other night, where they know his case and they've spoken out for him. So a lot of people around the world are speaking out. It's harder to speak up in Hong Kong because you risk getting the government on you. As far as companies leaving, the problem with companies leaving is they don't hold a parade if they're going to get out. They kind of sneak out, or they don't replace someone that leaves. Then they get down to a small core and they transfer the people. But that's what made Jimmy's papers so popular, because he would report on negative news. He didn't just have happy reports about China and Hong Kong. He told people what was going on. He's in prison because he and his paper tried to tell the truth about Hong Kong. And you can't do that anymore with impunity. People have to look over their shoulders. So the importance of this, as Mary kind of alluded to, it's one thing if you're Moscow or Beijing doing this. When you purport to be an international finance center and you have political prisoners, they're fundamentally incompatible. the free flow of information. And the Hong Kong government is desperate to burnish their credentials as an international center of finance. That's why the same week Jimmy's trial resumed and they sentenced the 45 Democrats to jail, they were holding a meeting with world financial leaders designed to say, hey, Hong Kong's great, nothing has changed, and sooner or later it's going to come to the crunch. And so I think it's like the investment in China, the foreign investment, it's kind of ebbing out as people find alternatives, find ways to protect themselves. It doesn't bode well for Hong Kong's future as a finance center. And that's what they're really worried about.
Yeah, that's very well put. Do any of you have an idea of any internal resistance to what's going on in Hong Kong? I mean, as I said at the outset, it's changed culturally. I mean, you can see it. Anybody who was there before 2019 and has come back now sees it immediately. Go ahead, Mark.
I mean, well, from the outside looking in, the first thing you'd have to look at is the coverage of Jimmy's trial. In other words, how's that being covered? As Father, as you saw, I mean, basically, you would think they were bringing in Carlos the Jackal every day, machine guns. I mean, is Jimmy going to jump out with Jason Bourne or something like that? And that's it. There's no chance of a violent upheaval and support, because basically they have all the means of control in the government. They have a lot of them. But you can see it in the media. The two major newspapers that really don't like Jimmy, we never really got along with them as papers. They're playing this very straight. And I was talking to one of the former editors the other day, and he said that's because everybody in Hong Kong is on Jimmy's side. Everybody knows how ridiculous this is. Look, for those who don't remember, everybody knew in 2003 the role that Jimmy played and Apple Daily played in fighting Article 23. In 2008,
define what Article 23 is for the audience.
Article 23 is it's now is basically an anti-sedition law. It's basically a clamped down national security law. Think of how a government would want to control you. Ultimately, that's Article 23.
Right.
And we fought that off in 2003. They put it on in 2021 or 2022. Right. So what happens is that you're seeing that the people of Hong Kong, they're not going to march in the streets, because that's going to get you in jail. I mean, if you wear a T-shirt, if you hold up a blank piece of paper, you're going to get 30 days in jail. So people are not in that way. But the sentiment of the street, everybody there, from what I understand, is the vast majority of people are with Jimmy. Hence, the local media there really can't attack Jimmy very well. In other words, the South China Morning Post has been writing some rather nasty stuff about Jimmy in their reviews, of taking government's view on everything, and that gets a lot of pushback. But look, the place has changed. It's no longer the free-flowing place that it once was. So you're seeing things come up in a different way. Most importantly, people are voting with their feet. They're still leaving. People are still leaving on a regular basis. It hasn't really slowed too much. And companies are sneaking out. They're pulling out. And that's the resistance. The resistance is going to be just leaving. I said one time a while ago, the Jews were Hitler's gift to the world, and the Hong Kong people leaving are Xi Jinping's gift to the world. And we should get as many of them as we can as they leave. And one in particular we should send back to Great Britain, and he'll go, is Jimmy Lai. And that's the one final thing, the point I'd make. People in Hong Kong now know that Jimmy will leave. If Jimmy will leave, that takes a lot of pressure off Hong Kong. Let's just be honest. So who is keeping the pressure on Hong Kong right now? It's the Hong Kong government. So to keep what's going to be a 77-year-old man in jail, just because the local authorities have to have some justification for their existence, they're now crushing Hong Kong. Jimmy leaves, a lot of pressure goes off.
Do we have any sense of how much the Hong Kong government is taking their orders from Beijing?
100%.
Yeah, totally.
It's not just the Hong Kong government; it's Beijing.
No, I think Beijing is stuck. That's the opinion of people.
Sorry. And Jimmy's a British citizen, right?
Jimmy's a British citizen. Jimmy will leave. He's been very clear. Look, Jimmy stayed to try to defend the paper. He didn't want to abandon people. He and I had many, many talks about this. Some kind of heated, where we wanted him to leave. The number of people that wanted Jimmy to leave was phenomenal. Mary's old boss, Mary, everybody was telling Jimmy to get out. He decided to stay. He's lost. We understand that. The war is over. If you want to call it a war, the battle is finished. At the end of these battles, people get to go home. If you send Jimmy back to the UK, a lot of pressure on Hong Kong would stop, and maybe, just maybe, they could start getting their feet under them. But as long as Jimmy's in prison, as long as they keep locking people up for silly things, Hong Kong is not going to come back.
Do you suppose that Beijing is afraid of Jimmy becoming a Solzhenitsyn in exile?
No.
No.
I think they take the Lee Kuan Yew attitude. Lee Kuan Yew, if they're not here, they're not a problem. Yeah. In other words, Jimmy can look at the dissidents outside today. Solzhenitsyn, it was a different time, different thing. But Solzhenitsyn's not what brought down the Soviet Union. I mean, he provided a lot of insight. But Jimmy's not going to come out and add the tipping point to everybody deciding that the Chinese Communist Party is an evil Leninist party. We already know that.
May I just add something to that, Father? Because often when I talk to clients or politicians, et cetera, they'll speak from a U.S. or a Western point of view. What's the U.S. stance on China going to be in this next administration? And that's not really the point. The question is, what is Beijing's behavior going to be? Because all of these measures that have been put in place, tariffs, the designation of genocide and crimes against humanity, travel restrictions, sanctions, etc., the flowing of capital out of China, the shrinking of the Chinese economy, the misery on the Chinese people, that's all because of the behavior of the regime. It's because of them and what they are doing. And the unfortunate thing, and I just wanted to add to another point made earlier, there's a double tragedy in Hong Kong because it's not just the regime in Beijing making clear what they want. There are local Hong Kongers serving as the lackeys of the regime in Beijing. It's Hong Kongers oppressing other Hong Kongers, which makes this, I think, just doubly abhorrent and doubly tragic. But you can see the verdict of the world with people and capital leaving. Mark's absolutely right. They continue to leave. There's a steady drumbeat, and my hope is that President Trump and his administration will work to get Jimmy out. The president has mentioned him by name. He's aware of his plight. He has pledged that he would work to get him out, and I very much hope that this is a much stronger possibility with President Trump in office, taking a harder line, and we just pray that it's so.
Do any of you have a sense of what the thinking in the mainland is, not just the governmental entities, but the popular sense? Are they aware of this trial? Are they aware of the consequences, the potential consequences for all of this?
Yeah, Father, I think they are aware because increasingly when some international group supports Jimmy, or like the Prime Minister of the UK calls for his release, a lot of the responses are from mainland officials, the foreign ministry in particular. So they're aware of it. And I think as Mark and Mary are suggesting, there are good reasons for them to make a deal on Jimmy. They won't do it until after they convict him and probably sentence him. They invested so much in this trial. But as the Wall Street Journal, pointed out in an editorial a few days ago, there's good reasons because the Hong Kong government has so many people that are under U.S. sanctions, including the chief executive, John Lee. You have Congress talking about more sanctions. You have the incoming Trump administration taking a much more hostile line to China than before. So all these things are coming together, and they make it in China's interest to have a deal. Mark also mentioned Jimmy's older, has diabetes. They sure don't want him dying in jail like a previous Nobel Prize winner did once. So I think there's a lot of lot of reasons they should make a deal, maybe on sanctions or something to get rid of Jimmy. And as Mark also suggested, it's important because he's portrayed as a mastermind. I mean, I'm watching the trial. I can't figure out whether the Hong Kong government is accusing Jimmy of carrying out an American plot to undermine China and Hong Kong, or whether they think he's a mastermind who got America to carry out a plot to his plot to undermine China and Hong Kong. But that's what they believe. Once he's dealt with, I think there can be leniency toward the other people. Many, not all those people, also don't have long sentences, so they'll be getting out in a year or so anyway.
Father, there is, sorry,
Mark.
There is one thing I'd point out. Look, Hong Kong was an incredibly valuable economic jumping off point for American companies. It was probably the most valuable business location in Asia for the US because it was basically our springboard into not only China, but the rest of Asia, thanks to the rule of law and a free press that it had. I was speaking about a week ago with a gentleman who in no way would be seen as pro-Western. He's probably pro-Beijing in everybody's eyes. And it was just a casual conversation, checking up on a few things. And one of the points he made was Beijing obviously knows what they're losing with Hong Kong. They know that they're missing out on a lot of things. And they're also seeing something else happen in Hong Kong that they're probably not happy about. For all the time that Hong Kong was in existence under Beijing's rule up until, let's say, 2020, essentially the Chinese allowed the Hong Kong government to operate on Western, what I call Western business values, Western business rules. In other words, Hong Kong was not a money laundering spot. It was not a spot for illicit trade. The governments cooperated, Hong Kong government cooperated with all international agencies, Interpol, US Customs, everybody. That has ceased. And Hong Kong is now becoming a center for illicit trade. It is becoming a center for money laundering. Know your customer rules are slackening. Everything about it is going downhill because what good money was coming in before is now being replaced with dark money. And I think Beijing is aware of that. He's aware of that. And we're going to see if they really value that or if they're just content to have Hong Kong turn into another money laundering center like Macau.
Yeah. It's really important. We just have a few minutes left. I wonder if each of you could address yourself to the question of what next? What do people need to do to make this case better known, to bring pressure on the powers that be? Let's start with you, Mary.
Well, there are a number of things that viewers out there can do. First of all, those of us who are lucky to reside in free societies, republics, democracies, can go and lobby their elected representatives to loudly make the case for Jimmy's release. Secondly, you can go to your local Chinese consulate or embassy because they have missions peppered all over the democratic world. Stand in front with a sign, see what happens.
Known and unknown.
Calling for Jimmy's relief. There are NGOs that you can get involved in. You can support places like the Acton Institute that are lobbying for Jimmy's release, or the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, which was previously referenced by Mark and Bill, which is doing really an incredible amount of work around the world. There are many democracies out there, for instance, the Irish government, the current British government, which I think has a special duty to Jimmy, that are cozying up to Beijing, that are not doing everything that they could to lobby for his release. So you can pray for him in church. You can donate to causes. I mean, there are many things you can do. You can inform your family members and your friends. Right. You can show them the Hong Konger movie. Just get out there, be vocal. Figure out the right way for you to participate. But I think that the louder our voices are, the greater the chances that Jimmy comes home.
Mark, 1 minute from you on this.
Everything Mary said, and maybe if you're going to your parish or your church, ask your bishop, send your bishop a letter, say, where do you stand on Jimmy Lai? Give him a little bit of information, a link, and ask him that. That helps send the message up the channel that, you know, people care. The other thing I would do is the only thing I would add is there's a lot of U.S. companies that are going over to China and doing business. If you're a shareholder, send them a note and ask that they basically abide by the same laws and rules that we have in this country that we have in this country over there. And the final thing is, if you get a chance, if you're on social media, if you have friends or something like that, share a note on Jimmy Lai. It matters. It really does matter. Share a note. You never know what happens. And everyone just needs to keep pushing forward. I firmly believe that we will get Jimmy out. I really believe it's possible, but it's only going to happen if everybody pushes together.
Thank you, Mark. That's very helpful. Bill?
Yeah, I agree with Mark. Look, let's remember, about a month ago, Donald Trump was asked about Jimmy Lai, whom he said positive things about before. And he said, yes, he'll bring his case up with President Xi. He'll get him out. And he even said it was easy. We have to hold the president to that promise, you know, and make good on it. Yes. And to pressure Xi. I'm also encouraged, Senator Marco Rubio has signed pro-Jimmy Lai petitions and so forth as a senator. So I think he'll be high on his list of priorities as Secretary of State. So I think for the first time in a few years, have a little optimism. You know, when Jimmy was first in there, you know, I heard that he's talking with the guard, and the guard said, you know, how can you be so cheerful, you know? And he goes, oh, well, I won't always be in here. And the guard said, you know, you're facing life sentence. You know, what are you talking about? Jimmy just said, I don't see it that way. And I think he thinks ultimately his case will prevail, and things are turning in his direction. As I say, China, not from Jimmy's interest, but from their own self-interest, they have to ask themselves, is it really worth it to keep this man in prison when we're getting so much international condemnation from the UN, various presidents and prime ministers, the European Parliament, and all sorts of other groups? Is it really worth it to have that pressure, which will stay as long as Jimmy's in jail?
Well, we have to keep the momentum going. Mark, Bill, Mary, thank you so much for being with us. I think this is a hopeful note to end on. In a moment, you're going to see the trailer for the Hong Konger, which you can go to and view free of charge on YouTube and other places. Link that on your social media. Let other people know about that, and pray. You know, we have a very ecumenical audience watching this. We've talked a lot about the relation to the Catholic Church and all this, but this is not just a Catholic issue. This is obviously an issue of religious freedom for all people. So thank you very much to our viewers who have watched from all over the world. And you can get in touch with us through acton.org, acton.org. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Thank you again for joining us for this special event. To learn more about Jimmy's story, we encourage you to visit thehongkongermovie.com. There you can watch for free Acton's documentary titled The Hong Konger, Jimmy Lai's Extraordinary Struggle for Freedom. Thank you for your support for Jimmy's cause.
The future, which is unknown and uncertain, is still unknown for me, but is certain.
Freedom was a very short journey for me.
He came as basically a refugee from China when he was a teenager.
I was put in the bottom of the fishing trunk, and by the afternoon, we arrived in Hong Kong. And the same night, I was taken to a factory to work as a worker. Well, we eat and sleep in a factory.
He was so poor, not highly educated.
It was a very happy time. It was a time that I know I had a future.
For a Chinese, that's like going from Kansas in black and white to Oz, where everything seems like it's possible.
As long as you wanted to work, you could make it in Hong Kong.
But British gave us all the institutions of freedom. Freedom of speech, rule of law, property right, freedom of assembly, and let our resourcefulness flourish.
They went from an incredibly poor city to a metropolis.
So I started a very small factory.
He's a classic entrepreneur.
And then I went into retailing.
Giordano was this huge brand.
If I just go on making money, it doesn't mean anything to me. If I go into the media business, I deliver choice, and choice is freedom.
Apple Daily played a very important role in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement.
We've never had a territory of 7.5 million people who have lived and breathed their basic freedom, having that taken away from them. Hong Konger means determination, fearlessness, the belief in human rights.
Mr. Lai insisted on marching in front where the authorities could see him.
I've been arrested 3 times.
The Hong Kong police raided the Apple Daily compound.
It's very likely that, I will have to go to prison.
He chose to stay in Hong Kong.
Their house is firebombed.
All I had, this place gave me.
I watched this man willingly give up the life of a billionaire to become a dissident.
This is a time for sacrifice. Even if they kill me, I will have to fight to the last day.
He's probably the most famous newspaperman now jailed in the world.
I earned freedom, my life.